not perfect, and not a Democrat. That's quite an introduction. Now, some of you I have known for a long time, and others of you don't know me at all. So what I would like to do this evening is just really introduce myself, tell you how I was raised, and how some of my experiences have really shaped how I see the issues that are confronting our state. And then what I would like to do is just throw it open for question and answers. But to give you the real quick bio of myself, I was born in Morton. Does anybody know where Morton is? Oh, here we go. We have a lot of people. Morton's a small town on the White Pass Highway, sort of between Yakima and I-5. And I was born there. My grandparents grew up there. Or actually, grandparents moved out here during the Dust Bowl. Mom and Dad grew up there. And I didn't live very long in Morton because shortly after I was born, Dad got a job teaching school at the Hood Canal School District over on the Olympic Peninsula on the Skokomish Reservation. And so Dad taught school there, and I really grew up at the base of the Olympic Mountains, which was an incredibly huck-finn existence. Growing up really with the Olympic Mountains as my backyard and Puget Sound right there in the front, and really no one lived out there at that time, so I could just roam all around, and it was a great way to grow up. I went back east to school and got a degree in trade diplomacy, and then came home to work for Governor John Stone. To give you a sense of what it was like before I took off for school and growing up in Hoodsport, let me share with you a story about how I got my first bike. And I'll share that with you because I think it gives you a sense of sort of how I grew up. But I was 8 or 9 years old, I think, and I wanted a new bike. And this was something of a problem in the Bryant household because only a few months before, Santa had brought me a bike. The problem was, the bike that Santa brought me, while it was all cleaned up, had Pat painted on it. Pat was my cousin. I wanted my own bike. And my parents said, well, Santa brought you this bike. This is a perfectly good bike. I said, well, I want my own bike. And they said, well, then if you want your own bike, you're going to have to earn the money. Now, again, this is the early 1960s in Hoodsport, a little town at the base of the Olympic Mountains. There wasn't a whole lot of opportunities for an 8 or 9-year-old to really earn money, especially enough to buy a bike. But I was downtown one day, and I overheard, this is early in the spring, I overheard some tourists talking about how disgusting the bathrooms were at the 3 gas stations in town. And town was the highway with some buildings on both sides, and 2 gas stations on one side and 1 on the other. And there were 3, and I heard them talk about how disgusting they were. And I got the idea that what I would do is go get some cleaning supplies. And I did, and I went to each of the owners of the 3 gas stations and said, I'll clean your bathrooms every Saturday for 75 cents a piece. And 2 of the 3 signed up, which meant that I was making $3 a week and $12 a month, which was huge money in the early 1960s in this sport. An 8 or 9-year-old couldn't spend $12 a month in the 1960s. There was nothing to buy. But it wasn't at the end of that summer enough to get a bike. And Mom and Dad said, well, that's really too bad because you have a perfectly good bike. And they didn't kick in. So I kept that money, and the next summer I moved down to Mossy Rock, by Morton, where I was born, and moved in with my grandparents, and I started in raspberries, started with strawberries, and then raspberries, and then blueberries, and picked berries all summer, and at the end of that summer I had enough money to buy a bike. I'll tell you, Mom and Dad, after that first year, might have been able to kick in. I don't know. They really didn't have very much starting out. But they didn't. And they made it very clear that they weren't going to because they wanted me to understand that life wasn't just going to come my way. That I was going to have to work hard for everything I got. And I think it was that ethic that I learned at a very early age that got me through Georgetown when I was back east, because I had to work my way through school for those 4 years. Came home, worked for Governor Spellman, the last Republican governor, doing international trade work for him, and then stayed on for the first few months of Governor Gardner's administration to get them squared away. And then I moved to Yakima. The apple industry, this is the early 80s, the apple industry was looking at a 50 million box crop, and they had no idea how they were going to profitably market 50 million boxes. Because for the most part, we shipped a little bit overseas, but we pretty much sold all the apples in the United States and Canada. And they knew there was a limit to how much they could sell in the United States and Canada, and that they were going to need to open up export markets. And so I was hired to come over, and I moved to Yakima to open up new export markets around the world for our Washington State apples. At that time, like I was saying, we were growing 50 million boxes. I think we were exporting probably about 10% of the crop, 5 million boxes. That changed over the course of the 10 years that I was there working with them. And not only did we increase our exports and open up markets around the world, but they taught me two very important lessons. At the time, I didn't realize it, but they were two lessons that really prepared me to later set up my own company and then go on to serve in public office and prepared me to become governor. Let me tell you the first one. The first one is the importance of coalitions, pulling people together behind a vision. Because really what I had to do is I had to open up markets, countries that were not allowing us to ship our apples into their country. I had to go open up that market so we could export our apples there. So it really required me going to a company or a country like Mexico. It wouldn't allow us to ship apples to Mexico. And go down and meet with their Ministry of Foreign Affairs and their Ministry of Agriculture and their Ministry of Economy, Finance, and talk to them about why they weren't letting our apples into their country. And if I were talking to 4 or 5 ministries, I usually got 4 or 5 different answers on why they weren't letting us into their country. So I had to get them on the same page of what it would take for us to be able to export our apples to their country. And usually they want us to grow them slightly differently or package them slightly differently or do something different than what we would normally do. Then I come back to Yakima and Wenatchee and sit down with the industry and say, okay, we can ship our apples to this country, to Mexico, but you're going to have to grow them slightly differently or store them slightly differently or package them a little bit differently. And the guys go, we're not doing that. And then our apples are good the way they are. And then you say, okay, let's figure out how we can do what we normally do and what we do so well, but also in a way that will meet the needs of this foreign government. And then I had to go to Washington, D.C. and make sure that our Department of Agriculture and our Department of State and our trade representatives understood what we were doing and actually could help us get it done. It was three-dimensional chess. You had to keep the industry and both governments moving in the same direction. That required having an understanding of where we wanted to end up, and then helping each of those parties understand why it was in their best interest to help move towards that endpoint and build a coalition behind that vision. I think that is exactly what we do not have in Olympia right now. We have a governor who is incapable of pulling people together. He's introduced a divisive, hyper-partisan style that actually drives people apart. And as a result, after 3 years, he has no record of accomplishment. He has nothing to show for it. And the people of Washington State know it. The number of people who say this state is moving in the right direction has not been this low since 2004. Who knows what happened in 2004? Dino Rossi ran for the first time. It has not been this low since the 2004 race. The other thing which we need to bear in mind is because he has no record of accomplishment, because he's been such a divisive figure, his re-election rate right now is somewhere between 30 and 40%. Only 30 to 40% of the people in Washington State want to re-elect him. That's because he's demonstrated an incapacity to pull people together behind a common vision. The other lesson I learned from the apple industry is the importance of having a strategic plan. And to put it that way, what they said was, you better make sure that what you're planting today is what you want to harvest in 7 years. But that industry, because of that, is always thinking 7 to 10 years out. That's why they hired you to begin opening up export markets long before they knew they were going to need them, because they could look at the growth that was coming in a few years. That was an incredibly important lesson for me when I was setting up my company. By 1992, I had opened up enough markets for the apple industry that we weren't just selling 5 million boxes. We were selling tens of millions of boxes all around the world. This year we'll probably grow about 110 million, twice what we were when I joined the industry. And I bet you we'll be exporting about 30 to 40% of that, over 30 to 40 million boxes of apples. When I came on, I think we were exporting about 5 million boxes around the world. We export 10 million boxes to Mexico alone this year. So by 1992, we had opened up enough markets around the world that other agricultural groups began coming to me. Hops, potatoes, Florida citrus, soybeans. And they were saying, well, we got a problem in Germany, or we got a problem in Australia, what would you do? And I realized that there was a niche there. And so in 1992, Barbara and I moved over to the coast, and I set up my company. And that's really when I realized the importance of having that strategic plan. And I call it a company, but when I started off, it was me and a fax machine and a card table in my basement. And within a year, we had enough, or I had enough business that I needed to bring on a partner. And James and I sat down and we said, okay, where do we want this company to be in 7 to 10 years? And I got to tell you, in those early days, we turned down clients because we knew it would distract us from where we wanted to actually end up. And we put all of our resources behind making sure that we would build a company that looked like our strategic plan direction. Our state today doesn't have a strategic plan. And that's unconscionable given the assets that we've got. Think about how the assets that we have in Washington State. We have the ports, trade, transportation. We have technology. We have tourism, the fourth largest employer in the state. We have manufacturing, everything from Boeing to precision equipment in Walla Walla to carbon fiber in Moses Lake. We have the military. We have medical science, medical research, global health. We have agriculture. We have forestry. We have fishing, and we have energy. There are a lot of states that would like to have 3 or 4 of those. We have all 10. But we have no real sense of where we want to, how we want to leverage those resources for how to create a job-generating future. If you don't have a vision of where you want to take your resources, your assets, and you don't have a budget that moves you towards that vision, then what you don't have is any sense of strategic direction. And in the private sector, if you don't have a CEO who's articulating a strategic direction, and then make sure that you have your budget complementing that direction, and you pull together your staff so they're all moving in the same direction, if you don't do that, you essentially turn over your company to your managers, which is a great way to put it into a maintenance mode at best. In the public sector, if you don't have a strategic direction, you don't have a budget that complements it, you're essentially turning over your government to the agency heads, the enforcers, and the regulators. And you know what happens when you turn your government over to the agency heads, the enforcers, and the regulators? You get a culture of no. I got a call in July from the CEO. He said, Bill, I just got out of a meeting, not final, not at all public, and we're not even sure we're going to do it, but I want to give you a heads up. And it's still not final or public, but good. It's very possible that by the end of the year, we'll be moving a few hundred jobs out of Washington State. I said, okay, why? He said, well, there's a culture of no. He said, every time I want to do something or expand, I've got 2 or 3 agencies telling me why I can't do it. Or if I'm going to do it the way they want me to do it, it doesn't pencil out. He said, in this other state, the governor's got 2 agency heads sitting around the table with me trying to help me figure out how I can get it done. He said, until we change the culture in Washington State to a culture of yes, to one that encourages expansion and job generation, we're going to continue to lose jobs in Washington State. That can't be allowed to happen. We need to turn that around. We have far too many assets to have a culture of no. We need a culture of yes. The other lesson that I learned from the street food industry and then setting up my own company was the importance of fiscal responsibility. If you're setting up your own company in your basement, or the fax machine, the card table, you got to watch every dime and every dollar. James and I did, and we followed the strategic plan. And as a result, today we're not alone in the basement anymore. We have about 35, 40 employees. We have offices in Seattle, Sacramento. We have projects in about 20 to 40 countries around the world at any given time. But that's because we have a strategic plan and fiscal discipline. By 2007, the company was to a point where I didn't have to be there every day. And I began looking at ways I could get involved in the community because I had had my head down in the company building it for the first 15 years or so. And I looked at the Port of Seattle and became very concerned. The Port of Seattle operates King County-wide, and it is responsible, even though it's King County-wide, it's responsible for about 200,000 jobs around Washington State. It's one of our top 5 job generators. When you combine it with the maritime port in Tacoma, 1/3 of our state's gross domestic product goes across those docks in the lakes of the Port of Seattle. It's responsible for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs. And I was concerned that it had no strategic plan, and it was being operated very fiscally irresponsibly. When I was running for office in 2007, the first time, the Port of Seattle Commission would raise the property tax every year to the maximum amount, the maximum legal amount, whether it needed it or not, just because it could. And it's like, that continues. And if we don't have a strategic plan on how we're harnessing these assets, we're going to have a situation where we are losing tens of thousands of jobs to British Columbia. So I ran on that platform as a Republican, although everything in King County is nonpartisan, but not nonpartisan if you're a Republican. And I ran and was elected with 50% in 50. No one thought that I would get elected in King County, but we talked to the voters about those issues, and it resonated. We stayed out of recount territory, which is an important thing to do. And since I was just as the elected, even though I was just elected, since I was the only business guy on the commission at the time, the other commissioner said, well, Bill, you know, even though you're a freshman, since you're the business guy, why don't you work with the staff on the budget besides you ran on this whole fiscal responsibility thing? That's great. So I started looking at the budget, digging in. The Port of Seattle budget, depending on what we build in any given year, is between $700 million and $1.3 billion. And I started looking at this budget. Well, you know, you've got these assets that are performing really well, but you've anchored them to these assets that, you know, are dragging them down and not performing. Why don't we divest ourselves of these, or at least separate them? And there's these programs over here, which probably made sense at one time, but no one can really tell me why we keep funding them and what they're really, you know, necessary for. So I think if we kind of streamlined those, or at least made them stand up to some sort of performance measures, I bet you we could put together a budget that holds the property tax flat. I thought I was going to be a hero. Instead, there were people on the staff who thought they had this young rogue commissioner who was going crazy on them, and stirred up that, you know, I was going to actually be undermining a lot of the efficiency of the operations, and they would, the way they were talking, you would have thought the planes were going to start falling out of the sky at CTAC. But I went out to the community, I remembered that exercise in building coalitions, and sat down with people and said, look, this budget is the first step in a 10-year process to restoring our financial credibility and to ensuring we have a strategic plan that's going to keep jobs here in Washington State. And if we continue to implement this plan, this is where we'll end up in 7 to 10 years. And I got them to understand what I was doing and to buy into that vision to begin working with me on it. Same with the staff. And then I had to go and meet with my colleagues, the other commissioners, to get the votes for this budget. One commissioner said, but why would we give them our money back? Number one, it's not our money. Number two, you can't give back what you haven't taken yet. But we got them to come around, and that year we passed a budget for the first time in over a decade that held the property tax flat. Every year since, we have passed a budget that has held the property tax flat or cut it. This is a chart that was going just like this and has been flattened out, and now it's gone down. I will leave the fort. My term is up at the end of this year. When I leave, we will be collecting in real terms fewer dollars than we were 8 years ago when I was elected, even though we have implemented that strategic plan. We have consolidated the seaports of Seattle and Tacoma to a single seaport, creating the third largest gateway in North America, LA, Long Beach, New York, New Jersey, Puget Sound. And we have a port that is working to keep tens of thousands of jobs here in Washington State. Contrast that to what we just went through in Olympus, where we had $5 billion in new revenue. And when the revenue forecast came out, we had a few $100 million more than we were anticipating. And it still wasn't enough. And we went into the longest legislative session in the history of Washington State. And ladies and gentlemen, we did not have an absence of revenue in Olympia. We had an absence of leadership in the governor's office. We have a governor who cannot pull people together behind coalitions, does not understand the basics of fiscal responsibility, whose answer is to create a culture of no, where you have more taxes and more regulations. And it's going to drive jobs out of our state unless we step up and make a change. And with your help, this time next year, we will have made a change. I can grab a drink of water. I will. I'll just take questions. What's that? Some wine. Yeah, some wine. I'm not driving home. We have to be in Bellingham tomorrow morning, so we are driving home tonight. But thank you, Scott.
How many containers do you handle it with?
Oh, don't ask me something like that. Oh, no, not fair.
You know.
I know. You know, we've combined the seaports. So we have now we have what's called the Seaport Alliance, so it's no longer the Port of Seattle, Port of Tacoma. Combined, we're at about million plus containers.
Most of them are still Canada.
Oh, you mean on the way up? Yeah, there's a few. They may arrive by truck regionally.
As well.
Yeah, anything within 500 miles probably arrives by truck, with some exceptions. Anything coming out of the American Midwest is coming by train. And that's why when I talked about when I was running, why we would possibly lose jobs, and it's why we pulled the seaports together, is that 70% of the cargo coming through the ports of Seattle and Tacoma is not bound to the Pacific Northwest. 70% of it is going to Chicago or St. Louis. We are the Midwest port. And same thing with stuff going in. Although 50% of what we ship out is agriculture or forest products. But a lot of it's still coming from the American Midwest. A lot of it's still moving. That product going to and from the American Midwest will go through whichever West Coast port can get it between Asia and the American Midwest most reliably, most quickly, and cost efficiently. It doesn't have to come from the Pacific Northwest. At the same time that we have been dawdling around trying to figure out how we're going to deal with deteriorating roads and inadequate rail infrastructure, the Canadian government has built a freight corridor between Prince Rupert and Vancouver directly to Chicago and St. Louis. That freight corridor is a direct threat to keeping jobs here in Washington State. One of the reasons why the port finally put aside a century of history and consolidated the seaport operations and transformed government to meet the needs of our time is because we realized that if we didn't change, if we clung to the old way of doing business, we were going to continue to lose market share and jobs to British Columbia. I think we could actually go to 7 million containers. We have the facilities to do it. We just need to have a state that will step up and use the assets we have to complement what the port does. We just, this last summer, so a year ago now, 15 months ago, July of 14, we decided to take, time passes when you're in the middle of the campaign. It was the 14th. We decided to take a terminal we call Terminal 5 dock. This is one of the best terminals on the West Coast. It has on-dock rail. It's right at the intersection of I-5 and I-90, two of our nation's most important freeways. It's got naturally deep water, a lot of land, but it will not accommodate the next generation of ships. When I was elected, the average size ship carried between 6,000 and 8,000 containers. For new ships, carry between 10,000 and 16,000 containers. 22,000 containers are on the drawing board. These are the size of small, a few football fields. Well, if we're going to keep the jobs here, we have to have docks that can accommodate these new ships. To take Terminal 5, which is already one of the best terminals on the West Coast, and upgrade it to accommodate these new ships, it's going to cost us between $350 and $400 million. It makes no sense to do that as a port if right outside the port gates the roads are deteriorating and we don't have grade separations that allow the trains to move at an adequate speed. And so the ports have done what they can to ensure we keep those jobs here, but it needs to be complemented by a state that wants to keep those jobs here.
How's the Panama Canal going to affect it? You just said.
When I ran for office in 2007, I talked about the Panama Canal a lot. In 2014, the Panama Canal was supposed to be expanded. It fell a little behind schedule. It's expanding now. But at the time, we were arguing that this freight that was going between either Vancouver or the Pacific Northwest to the Midwest would then have an all-water route between Asia and the Midwest through the Panama Canal going up to the Gulf. Because the ships could no longer fit through the old canal. It was too narrow for the new ships. So Panama is expanding it. It was supposed to open in 2014 or 2015. I saw that as one of the competitive threats that we needed to address, one of the reasons I ran. If there is a silver lining in all of this consolidation and the cost of rebuilding terminals, it is that the ships got bigger than even the new canal. They were not counting on these ships being 16,000 to 20,000 containers. So the big ships, even after they finished expanding the canal, the new ships are still not going to fit through. Now, they'll take a lot of the ships that will take 10,000 to 12,000, so it was still a competitive problem. But if we can build out terminals in Puget Sound, in Seattle, and Tacoma, so that we have 4 big ship terminals, we will be globally competitive and we keep those jobs here. not just important to the folks over on the coast. There are a lot of jobs in central and eastern Washington that depend upon being able to move products through there. The BMW carbon fiber plant in Moses Lake, anybody familiar with that? I mean, there was a, BMW was going to put a carbon fiber plant somewhere on the planet. The two finals were somewhere in eastern Canada and Moses Lake. Moses Lake got it because they had affordable land, affordable hydroelectric power, and direct access to a deep water port via I-90. They can bring in raw materials, put them on a truck, send them to Moses Lake, manufacture the carbon fiber, re-export them to the Port of Seattle. That business model doesn't work. Suddenly you have to export things through Vancouver, British Columbia, or Oakland, or Southern California. The Hay guys in Ellensburg need to be able to do 2 trips a day in order for that to go pencil out. Because of traffic congestion right now in Seattle, they're getting only 1.5 some days. But many jobs from Ellensburg to Spokane to Walla Walla to Moses Lake depend upon having that deep water port. It's an asset that we should not take for granted.
Tongue-in-cheek question, but serious. You mentioned generosity. What's your campaign going to do to make sure that a lot of dead people go broke?
Well, fortunately, King County's elections is not what it was in 2004.
Are you sure?
Yeah, I'm sure. And I had first-hand experience because when I was elected, it was one of the last elections where at least King County counted through the night. Now they count pretty much 8 o'clock and you're done until the next day. But they released the results at 8:20 or something that night, and I was down. But we realized that only Seattle had really voted. We looked at where the votes had not come in, so we felt pretty confident. At 10 o'clock, I had closed, but I was still behind. And the Seattle Times called and really wanted me to concede so they could go home. Literally. The reporter's like, I just want to go home, Bill.